Saturday afternoons were usually predictable inside a Hadley Group town car. 5-star hotels, shareholder lunches, quiet conversations about quarterly earnings and market forecasts. Holt Pemberton preferred predictable. Predictable meant nobody got hurt. Predictable meant he picked up his passenger, drove the route, opened the door, and returned home in time to read a bedtime story to his daughter. But nothing about this Saturday would remain predictable for very long. The shareholder brunch at the Camden Harbor Inn had lasted nearly 5 hours. By the time Holt guided the black town car onto Route 1, the coastal sun was hanging low behind them, pouring golden light through the rear window. In the back seat, Camille Hadley was asleep, or close to it. Her head rested against the leather. One heel had slipped halfway off her foot. A half-finished sentence lingered on her lips before dissolving into silence. Then she whispered a single word, "Mama." Holt's eyes lifted briefly to the mirror. For 3 years he had driven Camille Hadley. 3 years of board meetings, investor retreats, acquisitions, charity galas, and emergency conference calls. She rarely drank. She never lost control. She certainly never spoke about her family. Yet now, with wine softening the edges of her usual discipline, she looked strangely young, almost vulnerable. The car slowed at a red light. As it did, Camille's clutch slid from her lap and landed upside down on the floor mat. The clasp sprang open. Something slipped free. A photograph. Holt reached down automatically, then froze. The world seemed to narrow. The traffic light, the engine, the distant sound of gulls. Everything disappeared, because he knew the face staring back at him. He knew it as well as his own. For 10 years it had stood framed beside his wife's bed, 10 years beside Maggie's favorite books, 10 years beside the lamp she switched off every night before sleep. The woman in the photograph was Maggie's mother, the woman Maggie had spent her entire life wondering about. Holt stared for one impossible second, then another. The light turned green behind him. A horn sounded somewhere in the distance. He carefully folded the photograph and slipped it inside his coat pocket. Camille never opened her eyes. 20 minutes later, the town car rolled beneath the porte-cochere of the Hadley Camden Harbor Inn. A valet hurried forward. Holt waved him away. "I've got it." He stepped from the driver's seat and crossed to the rear door. Camille blinked awake as he offered his hand. "We're here, ma'am." She accepted the support automatically. Tired. Disoriented. Human in a way few people ever saw. At the elevator, she paused and looked at him through half-closed eyes. "Thank you, Pemberton." 3 years. 3 years, and she had never called him Holt. Always Pemberton. Always the driver. Always the employee. "Get some rest, ma'am," he said. She disappeared behind the closing elevator doors. Holt stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then he returned to the car. The drive back to Camden followed the inland route. Quiet roads, pine trees, late afternoon sunlight filtering through branches. He picked up his 7-year-old daughter Marlo from the babysitter at 4:30. She climbed into the passenger seat holding up a bandaged thumb. "Paper cut." Holt inspected it seriously. "Looks dangerous." Marlo nodded. "Extremely." He kissed the bandage anyway. That was part of the treatment plan. At home, they made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Marlo talked about school, about a map she was drawing, about a bird she'd seen near the harbor. Holt listened to every word. By 8:30 she was asleep before the end of the chapter he was reading. He closed her bedroom door quietly, then stood in the hallway listening to the silence of the house. Most people would have gone to bed. Holt walked downstairs instead. The basement workshop smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. A single lamp illuminated the workbench. On the highest shelf sat a wooden box. He hadn't touched it in 11 months. Slowly, he lifted it down. Inside rested pieces of a life he wasn't ready to forget. Letters. A folded scarf. Old photographs. Memories. He removed one photograph carefully, then reached into his coat and removed the second. For several seconds he simply stared. 2 photographs, same image, same young woman standing on a porch, same corner stain, same original negative. One copy had belonged to Maggie, the other had been sitting in Camille Hadley's purse. Holt lowered himself onto the workshop stool. The silence felt heavier now. Maggie had spent years searching for her birth mother. Letters, adoption agencies, church records, dead ends. She never found answers. Now somehow, by accident, a photograph had landed on the floor of a company town car. Holt looked at the two pictures side by side. His training from another life stirred quietly awake. The instincts that once made him a very good investigator. Coincidences existed, but not many. He pulled a small black notebook from his pocket, opened it, wrote 3 words, Hadley, not coincidence. Then he closed the notebook. Upstairs, the house remained peaceful. Marlowe slept. The harbor wind moved softly against the windows. Holt sat alone in the workshop, staring at 2 identical photographs and wondering whether a secret buried for 30 years had just found its way back to the surface. Holt Pemberton didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was worried. Worry implied uncertainty. What he felt was curiosity. The dangerous kind. The kind that had once convinced him to spend 14 months unraveling a trust fund fraud scheme spread across 4 states while working for the FBI. The kind that ended careers, marriages, and occasionally sent people to prison. At 2:14 a.m., he was still sitting in the basement workshop staring at the 2 photographs. By 2:17, he had already started making notes. Maggie's copy was older, slightly worn around the edges. The Hadley copy had been professionally preserved. Different histories, same source image, same woman, same porch, same summer dress, same smile. Holt leaned back in his chair. Coincidences happened, but photographs didn't duplicate themselves across unrelated lives. Upstairs, the house creaked softly in the night wind. Somewhere down the hall, Marlowe murmured in her sleep. Holt closed the notebook. He wasn't investigating anything. Not yet. The next morning arrived with rain. Camden Harbor disappeared beneath low gray clouds, while fishing boats drifted through fog like ghosts. Holt stood in the kitchen making pancakes while Marlowe sat at the table drawing maps. She always drew maps. Treasure maps. Neighborhood maps. Maps of imaginary islands populated by suspiciously organized squirrels. This morning's map featured a lighthouse and a pirate bakery. Holt had stopped asking questions months ago. "You're thinking too loud," Marlowe said suddenly. Holt looked up. "Thinking too loud?" She nodded. "Your forehead does the thing." "What thing?" She pointed. "The FBI thing," Holt sighed. Children were observant in deeply unfair ways. "I don't have an FBI thing." Marlowe looked unconvinced. "You absolutely have an FBI thing." Before he could respond, the doorbell rang. Neither of them was expecting company. Holt opened the door to find Theo Crane, standing on the porch, holding 2 coffees, and wearing the expression of a man who enjoyed arriving at inconvenient moments. Theo had been Maggie's cousin, which effectively made him family. He stepped inside without invitation. "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too." Theo handed him a coffee, then immediately noticed the photographs lying on the kitchen counter. His smile disappeared. "Where'd you get that?" Holt didn't answer immediately. Theo picked up the Hadley photograph, studied it, then looked back toward him. "That's not Maggie's copy." "No." Silence settled across the room. Marlowe looked between them. "Uh-oh," Theo nodded. "Correct." 10 minutes later, Marlowe had been bribed with pancakes and cartoons while Holt and Theo sat on the back porch. Rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Holt explained everything. The shareholder brunch, Camille falling asleep, the photograph sliding from her purse. Theo listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When the story ended, he stared toward the harbor for several moments. Finally he spoke. "You know what this means." Holt shook his head. "No, I know what it might mean." Theo laughed softly. "That's the FBI talking." Maybe it was. Holt wasn't interested in assumptions. Maggie had spent most of her adult life searching for her biological mother. She'd followed every lead, exhausted every possibility. Every search ended the same way. Nothing. Then she got sick. Then time ran out. Theo stared at the photographs again. If Camille Hadley has a copy, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication hung between them. Around noon, Holt drove to the Hadley estate. Sunday schedules were usually quiet. No meetings, no board sessions, no investor calls. He expected to spend 10 minutes returning a misplaced photograph and leave. Nothing more. The gates opened automatically. The main house sat atop a bluff overlooking the harbor, elegant without trying too hard. Holt parked near the entrance and walked inside. Camille was already waiting, dressed casually for once. No executive armor, no audience, no boardroom. She looked younger somehow, more approachable, until she spoke. "You have something of mine." There it was. The CEO was back. Holt removed the photograph from his coat pocket. Camille accepted it immediately. Relief flashed across her face before she could hide it. That reaction interested him. A lot. "Important?" he asked. Camille looked down at the picture. Her expression softened. "Very." Holt waited. She said nothing else. Most people would have left it there. Holt almost did. Then the investigator inside him made a terrible decision. "Who is she?" Silence. Camille's eyes lifted slowly. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't looking at him like a driver. She was looking at him like a problem. "Why do you ask?" Holt smiled faintly. "That's not an answer." Another silence. Then Camille surprised him. "My mother won't talk about her." Holt felt his pulse quicken slightly. "Your mother?" Camille nodded. "The only thing I know is that the photograph is older than I am." She looked back down at the image. "And every time I ask questions, my mother changes the subject." The room suddenly felt much smaller. Holt studied her carefully. She wasn't hiding information. She genuinely didn't know. Which meant whatever secret existed had been buried deeply. Very deeply. Camille slipped the photograph back into her purse. Then frowned. "Why are you asking?" Holt considered lying. Instead, he said, "Because I've seen that picture before." Camille froze. Completely. Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, rain drifted across the harbor. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell rang through the fog. Finally, Camille spoke. Quietly this time. "What do you mean you've seen it before?" Holt met her eyes. "I mean I have another copy." The silence that followed changed everything. Camille Hadley stared at Holt Pemberton as though he had just spoken a language she didn't recognize. For a moment, neither moved, neither breathed. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the harbor disappeared beneath gray fog outside. "You have another copy?" she repeated. Holt nodded. "Yes." Camille laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because disbelief occasionally arrived disguised as laughter. "That's impossible." "Probably." "Then explain it." Holt looked toward the water. He wasn't sure he wanted to. 3 years of driving Camille Hadley had taught him many things. One of them was that she didn't stop pulling on a thread once she found it, and this particular thread led directly into a part of his life he rarely discussed. "The photograph belonged to my wife." Silence. Camille blinked. "Your wife?" Holt nodded slowly. "Maggie." The name meant nothing to her. Yet. "Where did she get it?" Camille asked. "That's the problem." Holt met her eyes. She never knew. The room became quiet again. Camille sat down across from him. No longer CEO. No longer employer. Just a woman trying to understand why a stranger possessed a duplicate of something she'd carried for years. "Start at the beginning." Holt almost smiled. The request sounded very familiar. Witness interviews, financial investigations, fraud cases. Everyone always wanted the beginning. Unfortunately, beginnings were rarely simple. 20 minutes later, Camille knew far more about Maggie Pemberton than she ever expected. She learned that Maggie had been adopted as an infant. She learned that she'd spent years searching for information about her biological mother. She learned that every lead eventually disappeared. And she learned something else, something that left her staring silently at the photograph resting between them. "She died?" Holt nodded. 5 years ago. Camille looked down. "I'm sorry." The words arrived softly, genuinely. Holt wasn't accustomed to hearing genuine things from boardrooms and executive suites. It caught him off guard. "Thank you." Another silence followed. Then Camille asked the question neither of them could avoid any longer. "What was your wife's full name?" Holt knew the moment mattered. He could feel it. The strange sensation investigators experienced right before a case shifted directions. "Margaret Crane Pemberton." Camille froze. completely. Her expression changed in a way Holt couldn't immediately understand. "Crane?" she whispered. "Yes." Camille stared at him, then at the photograph, then back again. "My mother's maiden name is Crane." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Holt sat very still. Coincidences existed, but not like this, not repeatedly, not stacked on top of one another. Somewhere deep inside, old FBI instincts began arranging pieces into patterns. Across town, Eleanor Hadley was sitting alone in her sunroom when her phone rang. She almost ignored it. Almost. Then she saw Camille's name. "Hello?" Silence greeted her. Then her daughter's voice. "Mom." Eleanor immediately straightened. Something was wrong. Camille rarely sounded uncertain. "What's happened?" More silence. Then, "Who is Margaret Crane?" The teacup slipped from Eleanor's hand. It struck the saucer hard enough to crack porcelain. Neither woman spoke. 29 years disappeared in a single second. Eleanor stared toward the harbor. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "Mom?" Camille repeated. Eleanor closed her eyes. The question she'd spent decades avoiding had finally arrived. Not through lawyers, not through investigators, not through reporters, through her daughter, which somehow felt worse. "Where did you hear that name?" Camille's voice became very quiet. "That's her name, isn't it?" Eleanor felt tears gathering unexpectedly. "Camille, was she real?" Silence. Then another question. "Did you have another daughter?" The words landed like stones. Across the room, old memories stirred. A hospital room, a frightened, 19-year-old girl. Impossible choices. Regret carried across 3 decades. Eleanor lowered herself into a chair before her knees failed. "Yes." Camille stopped breathing for a moment. "Oh my God." Eleanor covered her eyes. There was no point denying it anymore. No point running. The truth had finally caught up. At the Hadley estate, Camille ended the call and stared blankly toward the windows. Holt watched quietly. He didn't need FBI training to recognize emotional shock. "Camille?" She looked at him slowly. Her face had gone pale. "My mother had a daughter before me." Holt said nothing. She gave her up. The words barely escaped above a whisper. The room became silent. Both of them understood what neither wanted to say. Finally, Camille looked toward the photograph again, then toward Holt. "How old was Maggie when she died?" Holt answered immediately. 36. Camille did the math. So did Holt. Their expressions changed at exactly the same moment, because the numbers aligned perfectly, too perfectly. The age, the timeline, the surname, the photograph, the missing daughter. Camille stood abruptly and crossed toward the window. Rain rolled across the glass. The harbor beyond looked blurred and distant, like another world. This can't be happening. Holt wasn't sure whether she was talking to him or herself. Then her voice cracked slightly. "If Maggie was my sister," the sentence stopped there. Neither finished it. Neither needed to, because both were thinking the same thing. Maggie was gone. 5 years too late. 5 years after answers might have mattered most. Upstairs, somewhere inside the enormous Hadley estate, a grandfather clock chimed the hour. The sound echoed through the house. Holt looked at the photograph resting between them. 2 copies, 2 families, 1 secret, buried for nearly 30 years. And now, for the first time, somebody had finally started digging. Eleanor Hadley hadn't slept in 32 years. Not completely. Not the way people slept when there were no ghosts waiting behind their eyelids. Some nights were easier than others. Some years were easier than others. But every morning eventually arrived with the same memory. A hospital room in Charleston. A frightened, 19-year-old girl. A newborn daughter she couldn't keep. By the time Camille arrived at the family estate the next morning, Eleanor was already sitting in the sunroom staring at the harbor. 2 untouched cups of coffee sat on the table between them. The second cup had been poured 40 minutes earlier. She knew her daughter well enough to anticipate what came next. Camille entered without greeting, without hesitation, without patience. "Tell me everything." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The words she'd spent decades avoiding were finally out of places to hide. "Sit down." Camille remained standing. "No. Fair enough. Eleanor deserved that. Her name was Margaret." The room became silent. Camille felt her chest tighten. Hearing Maggie's name spoken by her mother made the entire situation feel horrifyingly real. Not theory, not coincidence, not possibility, reality. I was 19, Eleanor continued quietly. My father controlled everything. My education, my money, my future. She looked toward the harbor, and when I became pregnant, the sentence faded. Camille already understood. Wealthy families specialized in protecting reputations, especially 30 years ago, especially families like the Cranes. What happened? Eleanor swallowed hard. I was told I had two choices. Her voice shook slightly. Give her away or lose everything. Silence settled heavily across the room. Camille felt anger rising inside her, not toward her mother, toward people long dead, toward decisions made before she was born, toward an entire system that treated human beings like inconveniences. Did you try to find her? Eleanor laughed softly. A broken sound. Every year. Camille froze. What? Tears appeared in Eleanor's eyes. Every year. She opened a drawer beside her chair and removed a stack of folders bound with worn elastic bands. Private investigators, search agencies, legal inquiries, church records, adoption requests, decades of attempts, decades of failures. Camille stared at the evidence. Her mother had never stopped searching. Not once. Then why didn't you tell me? Eleanor looked away. Because eventually shame starts sounding like silence. Neither woman spoke. Outside, gulls drifted above the harbor. The morning sunlight sparkled across the water. The world looked beautiful, which somehow made the sadness worse. Across Camden, Holt Pemberton sat inside a county records office, reviewing public documents. Old habits, old instincts, old skills. Once an investigator started seeing patterns, it became difficult to stop. The surname Crane appeared repeatedly throughout historical property filings. Trust documents, estate records, family holdings. Most were irrelevant. Then one detail caught his attention, a trust fund established in 1994. The year Maggie was born. Holt leaned closer. The document was heavily amended. Multiple revisions. Multiple beneficiaries added and removed over time. But one line remained visible beneath the legal modifications. Original beneficiary, female child, confidential designation. Holt's pulse quickened. He copied the file number immediately. Something about it felt important. Very important. By noon, Camille was sitting in Holt's kitchen, not because either of them planned it, because neither knew what else to do. Marlowe sat at the table coloring a map of imaginary islands, while the adults occupied opposite sides of the room. So, Marlowe looked up. Are you famous? Camille blinked. What? You look like somebody who owns buildings. Holt covered his face. Marlowe. What? The child shrugged. She does. To Camille's surprise, she laughed. The first genuine laugh she'd managed in 2 days. Marlowe seemed pleased with herself. See, she announced. I made the serious lady laugh. Holt shook his head. She's not wrong. For the next hour, something strange happened. Nobody discussed trust funds. Nobody discussed missing daughters. Nobody discussed family secrets. Instead, Marlowe explained cartography. Specifically, why her latest map contained 7 lighthouses and a bakery shaped like a whale. Camille listened carefully. More carefully than she listened to most board presentations. At one point, Marlowe slid a crayon drawing across the table. That's you. Camille examined it. The picture featured a stick figure standing beside a giant building. That's very flattering. I made your hair better, Camille smiled. Thank you. Across the room, Holt noticed something. For the first time since this entire situation began, Camille looked relaxed. Not CEO relaxed, human relaxed. The difference was significant. Then his phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name he hadn't seen in years. Marcus Bell. Former FBI colleague. Holt answered immediately. Marcus. Silence. Then a familiar voice. You investigating something again? Holt sighed. Hello to you too. Marcus laughed. I got your records request. Holt glanced toward Camille, then toward the trust document on the kitchen counter. I need information. Of course you do. Another pause. Then Marcus's voice became serious. The trust you're looking at isn't ordinary. Holt felt his stomach tighten. Explain. Silence. Papers shuffled. A keyboard clicked somewhere in the background. Finally, Marcus spoke. $45 million disappeared from that trust over 21 years. The room seemed to freeze. Holt sat upright immediately. Camille looked over. She recognized that expression. Investigators got a certain look when they discovered something important. What kind of disappeared? Holt asked quietly. Marcus exhaled. The criminal kind. Silence filled the kitchen. Marlowe continued drawing lighthouses, completely unaware that the world around her had just shifted again. Marcus spoke once more. And Holt? Yeah? Another pause. The trust was originally established for a child whose identity was sealed. Holt already knew where this was going. He just didn't want to hear it. Who? Marcus lowered his voice. Margaret Crane. The room became silent. Completely silent. Holt slowly looked toward Camille. Camille slowly looked back. Neither spoke. Because suddenly this wasn't just a story about a missing sister anymore. It was about $45 million, a hidden beneficiary, and somebody who had spent 2 decades making sure the truth stayed buried. Camille Hadley spent most of the night staring at the ceiling. $45 million. The number refused to leave her alone. Not because of the money itself. Hadley Group dealt with larger sums every quarter. What bothered her was the implication. A trust fund had been created for a child. That child was Margaret Crane, Maggie, Holt's wife, her sister, and somehow, over the course of 21 years, $45 million had vanished. Money didn't simply disappear. Someone moved it. Someone benefited from it. Someone spent decades making sure nobody asked questions. By dawn, Camille was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office overlooking Camden Harbor. The city below looked calm, ordinary, completely unaware that a secret buried for 3 decades was beginning to crack open. Her assistant appeared in the doorway carrying coffee. You have an 8 o'clock board call. Camille didn't turn around. Cancel it. The assistant blinked. The entire board? The entire board. May I tell them why? Camille finally looked over her shoulder. Tell them I'm busy discovering that my family apparently specializes in surprises. The assistant wisely decided not to ask follow-up questions. Across town, Holt Pemberton sat at his kitchen table reviewing trust records, while Marlowe ate cereal and attempted to teach a stuffed penguin how to read maps. The penguin appeared to be struggling. Holt wasn't doing much better. Every document raised more questions than answers. The trust had been established in 1994. The beneficiary designation had been sealed, yet someone had managed to access the funds repeatedly through a complicated network of amendments, transfers, and administrative revisions. None of it looked accidental. All of it looked familiar. Too familiar. Marlowe looked up suddenly. You're doing the forehead thing again, Holt sighed. Apparently I need a new face. Or fewer mysteries. That would have been nice. Unfortunately, life rarely consulted him before creating mysteries. His phone rang. Marcus Bell. Again, Holt answered immediately. Tell me, you found something. Marcus laughed softly. Good morning to you too, Marcus. Fine. Papers shuffled on the other end. I found the trustee. Holt sat forward. Who? Silence. Then Marcus spoke. Spencer Hadley. The kitchen became very quiet. Holt looked toward the harbor outside the window. For several seconds he said nothing. Spencer Hadley. Chairman of Hadley Group. Husband of Eleanor Hadley. Stepfather to Camille. One of the most respected businessmen in New England, and according to the trust documents, the man who had controlled Maggie's inheritance for over 20 years. That's impossible, Holt said finally. Marcus disagreed immediately. Actually, it's extremely possible. It's right here in the paperwork. Holt closed his eyes briefly. The pieces were beginning to fit together, and he didn't like the picture they were forming. 2 hours later, Camille arrived at his house. This time she didn't wait in the driveway, didn't sit in the car, didn't send a text message. She walked directly to the front door and knocked. Marlowe answered before Holt could reach it. The 7-year-old looked up at the CEO standing on the porch. Oh. Camille blinked. Oh? Marlowe nodded seriously. You're back. I am. Okay. Then she turned around and shouted into the house. Dad. The building lady is here, Camille laughed before she could stop herself. Holt appeared moments later. I'm never going to live that nickname down. Absolutely not, Marlowe announced from the hallway. Fair enough. They sat at the kitchen table while Marlowe worked on maps nearby. Camille listened silently as Holt explained what Marcus had discovered. At first she looked confused, then concerned, then pale. Spencer? Holt nodded. Spencer. She shook her head immediately. No. Maybe. No. The certainty in her voice surprised him. Camille leaned forward. You don't understand. Holt waited. Spencer tracks everything. She looked genuinely disturbed now. Every dollar, every expense, every account. He's obsessive. Silence settled across the room. Then Holt asked the obvious question. And if someone obsessive controlled a trust fund for 20 years? Camille didn't answer. She didn't have to. Across Camden Harbor, Eleanor Hadley sat alone in her study reviewing old correspondence. Since speaking with Camille, she had begun opening boxes she hadn't touched in decades. Most contained memories she wished she could forget. Then she found a letter, unopened, addressed to her. Dated 23 years earlier. Her hands trembled as she carefully broke the seal. She immediately recognized the handwriting. Maggie. Tears blurred her vision before she reached the second sentence. Dear Mrs. Hadley, I don't know if you're my mother, but if you are, I wanted you to know I'm okay. Eleanor stopped reading. Her breath caught. 23 years, and the letter had never reached her. Someone had intercepted it. Someone had hidden it. Slowly, she turned the envelope over. Another handwriting sample appeared in the corner, a routing note. Internal forwarding instructions. She recognized the signature instantly. Spencer. The room spun slightly. For years, she'd assumed Maggie never found her. For years, she'd believed silence meant absence. Now she realized the truth might be much worse. Someone had been controlling the information. Someone had been standing between them. Someone had decided what she was allowed to know. Eleanor stared at the signature, then reached for the phone. Her hand shook the entire time. That evening, Holt sat on the porch watching the sun disappear beyond the harbor while Marlowe colored maps beside him. The world looked peaceful, which felt misleading. His phone buzzed. A text message from Camille. 3 words. You were right. Then another message appeared immediately afterward. My mother found proof. Holt stared at the screen. A moment later, a third message arrived. Spencer intercepted Maggie's letters. The harbor wind seemed colder suddenly, because some crimes were about money, some were about power, and some were about stealing years from people who could never get them back. Holt looked toward the fading sunlight. His FBI instincts were no longer whispering, they were shouting. Someone hadn't merely hidden an inheritance. Someone had spent decades controlling an entire family's truth. And for the first time, Holt Pemberton was starting to understand why. Camille Hadley arrived at Holt Pemberton's house just after sunrise. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't even decided she was coming until halfway through the drive. The roads were nearly empty, washed pale by the soft blue light that appears just before morning fully wakes up. She parked across from the small white house overlooking Camden Harbor and sat in silence. For the first time in years, she had no strategy, no presentation, no negotiation plan. Just questions. Too many questions. Across the street, a porch light flickered off. A few moments later, the front door opened. Holt stepped outside carrying a mug of coffee. He wasn't dressed for work. Jeans, gray sweater, hair still slightly messy from sleep. The sight felt strangely normal. Then another figure appeared beside him. Marlowe. The little girl carried a rolled-up map almost as large as she was. Camille watched as Holt crouched to her level. They talked briefly. Marlowe pointed dramatically toward the harbor. Holt nodded with appropriate seriousness. Then they both laughed. Something tightened unexpectedly inside Camille's chest. The scene was so simple, so ordinary. Yet somehow it felt more real than most of the conversations she'd had in boardrooms over the last decade. Before she could reconsider, she stepped out of the car. Marlowe noticed her immediately. Building lady. Camille closed her eyes briefly. Holt looked embarrassed. I've tried. Not very hard, Marlowe replied. Fair point. Camille crossed the street. The harbor breeze carried the smell of salt water and pine. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Marlowe held up the map. Do you want to see the Lighthouse District? Camille blinked. The what? The Lighthouse District. Marlowe sounded disappointed she had to explain something so obvious. It's where all the important lighthouses are. Holt looked toward the sky as if searching for patience. Camille surprised herself by smiling. I'd love to. 10 minutes later, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, while a 7-year-old cartographer explained a fictional coastal region populated by sailors, whales, and an alarming number of bakeries. Holt made breakfast. Marlowe narrated. Camille listened. Somewhere during the conversation, she forgot she was a CEO, forgot about trust funds, forgot about board members and legal reviews and family scandals. She simply listened to a little girl describe a world she had created, and for the first time in days, the weight pressing against her chest eased slightly. Holt noticed. Of course he noticed. Former investigators noticed everything. After breakfast, Marlowe disappeared upstairs to retrieve additional maps. Apparently one map was insufficient. Camille watched her go, then looked toward Holt. She's amazing, Holt smiled. A genuine smile. Not the polite one she saw when he opened car doors. Yeah, silence followed. Comfortable silence. Then Camille reached into her bag and removed a folder. My mother found more documents. Holt immediately became serious. She handed them across the table. Old correspondence, internal trust records, estate management notes. Holt reviewed them carefully. Halfway through the stack, his expression changed. Camille noticed instantly. What? Holt tapped a signature. This. She leaned closer. What about it? Holt pointed again. The authorization code. Camille frowned. It looked like meaningless legal paperwork. I don't understand. Holt looked up. I do. His voice had changed. Sharper now. More focused. The FBI investigator was back. This isn't a trust administration code. He turned another page. Then another. It's a case tracking structure. Camille stared at him. What does that mean? Holt exhaled slowly. It means Spencer wasn't just moving money. Silence. Then he added quietly. He was documenting it. The room became very still. Upstairs, Marlowe could be heard singing to herself while searching for additional maps. Downstairs, 2 adults sat staring at paperwork that suddenly looked far more dangerous. Why would someone document fraud? Camille asked. Holt answered immediately. Because they don't think anyone will ever connect the pieces. Before she could respond, the front door opened. Neither had heard a car arrive. Both turned. Eleanor Hadley stood in the doorway. For a moment nobody moved. The older woman looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. Then her eyes drifted toward the staircase. Marlowe appeared at the top landing carrying a stack of drawings. She stopped when she saw the stranger. Eleanor stopped too. The world seemed to narrow around that single moment. Holt looked from Eleanor to Marlowe, then back again. He understood before anyone spoke. So did Camille. Marlowe walked slowly downstairs. Curious, unafraid, the way children approach things adults complicated. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. She stared at the little girl as though seeing a ghost and a miracle at the same time, because the resemblance was impossible to miss. Maggie's eyes, Maggie's smile, Maggie's posture. 30 years of regret crashed into the room at once. Marlowe looked confused, then held out one of her drawings. Do you like maps? Nobody expected the question, least of all Eleanor. The older woman laughed through tears. I don't know very much about them. Marlowe stepped closer and unfolded the paper. That's okay. She pointed toward a tiny lighthouse near the edge. I can teach you. Eleanor accepted the drawing with trembling hands. Then something inside her finally broke. Not dramatically, not publicly, quietly, the way old grief often does. She knelt in front of Marlowe. Tears rolled freely down her face now. You look just like her. Marlowe tilted her head. Like who? Eleanor couldn't answer. Not right away. Camille looked away toward the harbor. Holt stared at the floor. Some moments were too personal to witness comfortably. Finally, Eleanor whispered, Your mother. Silence settled across the room. Marlo thought about that carefully. Then she pointed toward a tree she'd drawn beside the lighthouse. I put that there because maps need things people can come home to. The room became completely still because without realizing it, a 7-year-old girl had just described the entire story. Eleanor closed her eyes. For 32 years she had been searching for her daughter. 5 years too late, she had finally found a piece of her waiting in a little house overlooking the harbor. And somewhere deep inside, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The truth was no longer hidden. It had finally come home. For the next 3 days, nobody talked much about the trust fund. Nobody talked much about Spencer Hadley either, not because the problem had disappeared, because something far more important had arrived first: grief. The kind that comes when people finally stop running from the truth. Eleanor Hadley spent nearly every afternoon at Holt's house. The first day she arrived carrying cookies she forgot to serve. The second day she brought old family photographs she couldn't bring herself to open. By the third day, she stopped pretending she had another reason to visit. She came to see Marlo. The little girl accepted this development without question. Children rarely demanded complicated explanations. Adults were the ones who insisted on making everything difficult. That Thursday afternoon, Marlo sat cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing another map while Eleanor watched from the couch. You always put lighthouses on them, Eleanor observed. Marlo nodded. They're important. Why? The child didn't even look up from her drawing. Because people get lost. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. And lighthouses help them find their way home? Marlo considered the question seriously, then shook her head. No. Eleanor blinked. No. The lighthouse doesn't bring you home. Marlo continued drawing. It just shows you where home is. Silence settled over the room. Holt stood in the kitchen doorway, listening. Camille sat beside him holding a coffee she had forgotten to drink. Neither spoke. Because somehow a 7-year-old kept accidentally saying the exact thing everyone needed to hear. Eleanor looked down at the map, then at the child beside it. 32 years. 32 years wondering what had happened to her daughter. 5 years too late to say everything she wanted to say to Maggie. Yet somehow this little girl kept handing her pieces of peace she didn't know how to ask for. Across Camden Harbor, Spencer Hadley was having a much worse week. The chairman of Hadley Group sat alone in his office reviewing legal notices that seemed to multiply by the hour. Federal inquiries, trust audits, internal reviews, requests for historical financial records. Individually, none of them looked catastrophic. Together, they looked dangerous. Spencer had spent 20 years building an image. Respectable, reliable, intouchable. The problem with images was that they depended on people never looking behind them. His office phone rang. He answered immediately. Yes? Silence greeted him. Then a familiar voice. We need to talk. Spencer closed his eyes. Camille, I'm busy. Not anymore. Her voice remained calm. That worried him more than shouting would have. Camille, tomorrow. 9 o'clock. The line disconnected. Spencer stared at the receiver. For the first time in years, he felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling. Fear. The next morning, Camille arrived at Holt's house before work. This was becoming a habit neither of them acknowledged. Marlo was at school. Eleanor had a meeting with attorneys. The house felt unusually quiet. Holt stood on the porch overlooking the harbor when Camille pulled into the driveway. The early morning sun painted the water gold. For a moment, neither mentioned investigations or trust funds or boardrooms. They simply watched the harbor. Finally, Camille spoke. I used to think success fixed everything. Holt glanced toward her. How's that working out? She laughed softly. Not great. Silence followed. Comfortable, familiar, dangerous in ways neither wanted to examine too closely. Camille leaned against the porch railing. Do you ever think about what Maggie would have done? Holt looked toward the horizon. The question arrived more often than people realized. Every day, Camille nodded slowly. I wish I'd known her. Holt smiled faintly. You would have liked her. How do you know? Because she would have challenged you constantly. Camille laughed. That's your argument? Absolutely. For several seconds, both smiled. Then the smile faded as reality returned. Camille looked down at the folder she carried. I have something. Holt immediately recognized the tone. Business. Serious. Important. She handed him the documents. He reviewed them carefully. Halfway through, his expression changed, then changed again. Where did you get this? Camille folded her arms. Internal records. Holt stared at the pages. Authorization logs. Trust distributions. Administrative approvals. Names. Dates. Transfers. Everything linked together. Beautifully. Terribly. This is it. Camille felt her pulse quicken. It. Holt looked up. Former FBI instincts fully awake now. Proof. Silence settled between them. Spencer Hadley hadn't simply overseen the trust. He had systematically redirected funds through a network of shell entities controlled by people connected to him. The pattern stretched back 2 decades. Precise, careful, intentional. Camille stared toward the harbor. So what happens now? Holt closed the folder. Now? He looked directly at her. Now somebody finally has to answer questions. Across town, Spencer Hadley stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hadley Group headquarters. The harbor sparkled below. Investors trusted him. Employees respected him. Board members followed him. For 20 years, he had controlled the narrative, controlled the money, controlled the truth. Unfortunately, truth had a habit of surviving, even when buried, even when delayed, even when stolen. And somewhere in Camden, a former FBI investigator was preparing to bring all of it into the light. The confrontation with Spencer Hadley lasted exactly 11 minutes. Camille timed it, not intentionally. Years of executive meetings had simply trained her mind to measure difficult conversations in minutes rather than emotions. When she walked into Spencer's office at 9 o'clock sharp, he was standing beside the windows overlooking Camden Harbor. The same view he'd enjoyed for 2 decades. The same view he'd probably imagined would always belong to him. He didn't offer her a seat. Camille didn't want one. You intercepted her letters. No greeting. No introduction. No warning. Spencer's expression didn't change. That alone told her enough. Camille, you intercepted Maggie's letters. Silence. The harbor shimmered below. Boats drifted through the morning sunlight. Somewhere far away, a gull cried out over the water. Inside the office, nobody moved. Finally, Spencer exhaled slowly. You don't understand the situation. Camille laughed. Not kindly. That's usually what guilty people say. His jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw irritation crack the polished image he'd spent years perfecting. I protected this family. By stealing from it? Silence. Again. Spencer looked away first. Another answer. $45 million doesn't disappear accidentally. Camille's voice remained calm. That frightened him more than anger would have. I know about the trust. Spencer turned toward the windows. Your mother told you. The documents told me. She stepped closer. The financial records told me. Another step. The letters you hid told me. The silence that followed felt final, like the last moments before a bridge collapses. Across Camden, Holt Pemberton sat at a marina cafe reviewing copies of the trust records, while Marcus Bell joined him carrying 2 coffees. The harbor stretched beyond them beneath a bright blue sky. Tourists wandered the boardwalk. Sailboats drifted lazily between docks. The world looked peaceful. Holt knew better. Marcus placed the coffee on the table. You were right. Holt looked up. About which part? The fraud. Marcus sat down. And the structure? Holt nodded slowly. The pattern was obvious now. Once he'd recognized it. Spencer Hadley hadn't invented anything new. He'd simply recycled a trust diversion scheme Holt had investigated years earlier while working federal fraud cases. Small transfers. Layered entities. Administrative authority. Gradual extraction. The kind of crime designed to remain invisible. Until somebody started following the paperwork. How strong is the case? Holt asked. Marcus smiled. Strong enough that 3 attorneys started sweating yesterday. That was encouraging. Back at Holt's house, Marlowe sat on the porch with Eleanor Hadley, working on a new map. This one was larger than usual. Much larger. Several sheets of paper had been taped together into a sprawling coastline. What's this? Eleanor asked. Marlowe pointed proudly. Family Harbor. Eleanor smiled. Family Harbor? Yep. The child pointed toward different sections. That's where everybody lives. A lighthouse, a dock, tiny houses, little roads connecting everything. Eleanor studied the drawing carefully, then noticed something unusual. One house sat far away from all the others, near the edge of the map, isolated, alone. Who lives there? She asked quietly. Marlowe looked down. Nobody. Eleanor frowned. Then why build it? The little girl considered that, then shrugged. Because maybe somebody's still trying to find their way back. Eleanor felt tears gathering immediately. Children had a way of aiming directly at wounds without realizing they existed. She reached over and squeezed Marlowe's hand. The child smiled and returned to coloring, unaware she'd just shattered another piece of a 32-year-old regret. By late afternoon, Camille found herself standing at the end of a weathered pier overlooking Camden Harbor. Holt stood nearby. Neither had planned the meeting. Somehow it happened anyway. The harbor stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunlight. Boats rocked gently against their moorings. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Camille broke the silence. I confronted Spencer. Holt nodded. How'd that go? She laughed softly, about as well as you'd expect. Meaning? Camille looked toward the water. He didn't deny it. Holt wasn't surprised. People rarely denied things when evidence became overwhelming. They changed subjects, explained motivations, claimed misunderstandings. Actual denials usually disappeared first. What's next? She asked. Holt leaned against the railing. The former FBI agent in him already knew the answer. Board review, investigation, audits, lawyers. Camille sighed. You make it sound exhausting, because it is. That earned another laugh, the comfortable kind, the kind that arrived more often lately. The harbor breeze moved through Camille's hair. For several moments she simply stood there watching the water. Then she asked something she hadn't intended to ask. Were you always this calm? Holt smiled. No. What changed? Silence. Then he answered honestly. Maggie. Camille looked toward him. He continued staring at the horizon. Life gets simpler after losing someone you love. His voice remained steady, not easier, simpler. She didn't interrupt. You stop wasting energy on things that don't matter. The words lingered between them. Camille thought about boardrooms, headlines, market valuations, endless meetings. Then she thought about Marlowe drawing maps at the kitchen table. Somehow one felt more important than the other. The sun drifted lower, gold reflected across the harbor. Finally, Camille spoke again, quietly this time. She would have liked you. Holt laughed. That's impossible. She married me. Camille smiled, then surprised herself by reaching for his hand. Not dramatically, not romantically, just briefly. Human to human. Shared grief, shared history, shared understanding. Neither mentioned it afterward. Across town, Spencer Hadley sat alone inside his office reviewing documents he already knew couldn't save him. For 20 years he'd controlled the story, controlled the money, controlled the narrative. But stories eventually belong to the truth. And the truth was moving closer every day. Somewhere beyond the harbor lights, attorneys were preparing reports. Auditors were reviewing records. Board members were asking questions. And for the first time in a very long time, Spencer Hadley no longer knew how the story ended. The trust fund story broke on a Monday morning. Not publicly. Not yet. The newspapers didn't know. The financial networks didn't know. Most of the Hadley Group board didn't know. But inside a secured conference room overlooking Camden Harbor, a handful of attorneys, auditors, and investigators were beginning to understand exactly how much trouble Spencer Hadley was in. Holt Pemberton sat quietly at the far end of the table reviewing a stack of financial records. To anyone else, he looked like a consultant. A former investigator offering technical insight. The truth was much more personal. Every page represented years stolen from Maggie. Every transfer represented opportunities she never knew existed. Every signature represented choices somebody made while believing they would never be caught. Across from him, Camille listened as forensic accountants presented their findings. The lead auditor cleared his throat. The total confirmed diversion currently stands at $43.7 million. Silence settled over the room. Even after hearing the number repeatedly, it still sounded unreal. $43.7 million. Not lost. Not misplaced. Redirected. Intentionally. The auditor turned another page. We're still reviewing secondary accounts. The final number may exceed 45 million. Camille folded her hands carefully. Years of executive leadership had taught her how to remain composed during difficult meetings. Today required every bit of that training. "And the beneficiary?" she asked. The room became quiet again. Everyone already knew the answer. They just hadn't said it aloud yet. Finally, the attorney spoke. The original beneficiary was Margaret Crane. Holt stared at the harbor beyond the glass walls. Maggie, the woman who spent years clipping coupons. The woman who worried about medical bills during her cancer treatments. The woman who never knew a trust fund established in her name existed. The irony felt cruel. Across town, Eleanor Hadley sat in Holt's kitchen helping Marlowe assemble another map. This one included ferry routes. Apparently, the previous version lacked sufficient maritime infrastructure. Eleanor found herself smiling more these days. Not because the situation was easy, because for the first time in decades, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. Marlowe pointed toward a small island she'd drawn near the center of the map. "That's the Inheritance Island." Eleanor blinked. "The what?" The little girl nodded seriously. "Inheritance Island. Why does the map need an inheritance island?" Marlowe considered that carefully. "Because everybody keeps talking about inheritance." Fair point. Children heard more than adults realized. Eleanor smiled. "And what happens there?" Marlowe shrugged. "People get back things that belong to them." Silence settled briefly across the kitchen. Then Eleanor looked away toward the harbor. Sometimes wisdom arrived wearing sneakers and carrying crayons. At Hadley Group headquarters, Spencer Hadley received notice of the emergency board meeting scheduled for Thursday morning. The email was short, professional, precise, which made it more threatening. 20 years of experience taught him exactly what it meant. The board wasn't requesting information. The board already had information. The meeting was about consequences. Spencer stared at the message for several moments, then opened a drawer. Inside rested a framed photograph. Camille, at 12 years old, standing beside him at a company event, smiling proudly. Spencer looked at the image and felt something unfamiliar. Regret. Not for the money, not for the scheme, for underestimating her. He'd spent years believing Camille could be managed, influenced, directed. He'd forgotten something important. She was Eleanor Crane's daughter. Stubbornness ran in the family. That afternoon, Camille drove to Holt's house after work. The habit no longer felt strange. Somewhere along the way, the small white house overlooking the harbor had become the only place where conversations felt honest. She found Holt sitting on the back porch reviewing legal documents, while Marlowe colored maps beside him. "Good news or bad news?" Holt asked without looking up. Camille sat down. "Complicated news." "My favorite kind." She handed him a folder. Holt opened it immediately. Halfway through, his expression changed. "Well, that's what I said." He looked up. The trust wasn't just for Maggie. Camille nodded. The discovery had surprised everyone. Additional provisions hidden inside the original documents revealed a secondary inheritance clause, one activated if the primary beneficiary died before claiming the assets. Holt already knew where this was heading. "Marlowe." Camille nodded again. Silence settled across the porch. The harbor shimmered beneath the late afternoon sunlight. Somewhere offshore, a sailboat drifted slowly toward the marina. Holt closed the folder carefully. "She has no idea what any of this means." "I know. She thinks inheritance is an island." Camille laughed softly. "Honestly, that's probably healthier." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Holt looked toward the yard where Marlowe was explaining lighthouse placement strategies to a bewildered golden retriever. "It's not about the money." Camille nodded immediately. She understood. The money mattered. The fraud mattered. The crime mattered. But the real issue sat deeper. The trust represented proof. Proof that Maggie had never been forgotten. Proof that someone intended to provide for her. Proof that 30 years of lies had hidden more than family secrets. "What would have happened if that photograph never fell out of my purse?" Camille asked quietly. Holt looked toward the harbor, then toward the house, then toward Marlowe. "I don't think about that anymore." "Why not?" He smiled faintly, because it did. The answer lingered between them. Simple, true, powerful. Across Camden Harbor, lights began appearing in office windows as evening settled over the city. Attorneys continued preparing reports. Auditors finalized findings. Board members reviewed evidence. And somewhere inside Hadley Group headquarters, Spencer Hadley sat alone with 20 years of decisions catching up to him all at once. The emergency board meeting was 2 days away. For the first time, the outcome seemed inevitable. And when Thursday arrived, the truth would finally walk into the boardroom. Thursday arrived cold, gray, and unforgiving. Camden Harbor disappeared beneath low clouds, while Hadley Group headquarters rose above the waterfront like a fortress preparing for a siege. By 8:45 a.m., board members were already filing into the executive conference room. Some looked nervous. Others looked angry. Most looked confused. They knew an emergency meeting had been called. They knew financial irregularities had been discovered. What they didn't know was how deep the problem went. Spencer Hadley sat at the head of the table exactly as he had for more than 2 decades. Calm, composed, impeccably dressed. To an outsider, he looked like a man completely in control. Inside, he felt something very different, because for the first time in 20 years, he no longer knew what information the room contained. At 9:00 sharp, the doors opened. Camille Hadley walked in first. Behind her came legal counsel, then forensic auditors, then 2 federal financial investigators. Conversations immediately stopped. Spencer's expression remained neutral. Barely. Camille took her seat. "Let's begin." The lead auditor stood and activated the presentation screen. Charts appeared, transfer records, account structures, trust documents, transaction histories. One by one, 20 years of hidden activity unfolded before the board. Silence settled over the room, then disbelief, then outrage. Several directors began flipping through documents faster and faster. Others simply stared. Finally, one board member looked toward Spencer. "Tell me this isn't accurate." Spencer didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Across town, Holt Pemberton sat on the porch watching the harbor. He had been invited to the meeting. He declined. Not because he wasn't interested, because some battles belong to other people. Marlowe sat beside him coloring a new map. This one contained an unusually large lighthouse. "That's a big one," Marlowe nodded. "It's the Truth Lighthouse." Holt smiled. "The Truth Lighthouse?" "Yep." She added another line with a blue marker. "It's so people can see it from really far away." Holt laughed softly. Children really did simplify everything. Back at headquarters, the board meeting was no longer calm. Questions flew across the room. Legal counsel reviewed evidence. Auditors explained transaction pathways. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Millions redirected. Documents altered. Beneficiary notifications intercepted. Administrative authority abused repeatedly over 2 decades. Finally, Camille stood. The room gradually became quiet. "For 20 years, she began, this company trusted one man to protect the interests of our shareholders, our employees, and our family." Nobody looked away from Spencer now. Instead, he protected himself. Silence. Spencer sat motionless. For once, he wasn't searching for an argument, because there wasn't one. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth had finally become too large to bury. Then the conference room doors opened again. Several heads turned. Holt Pemberton entered quietly. He hadn't planned to come. Then Eleanor Hadley called 30 minutes earlier and asked him to. So he came. Spencer looked up. The moment their eyes met, something changed. For years, Spencer viewed Holt as a driver, an employee, an inconvenience. Today he finally saw him clearly. The former FBI investigator who had followed a photograph all the way to the truth. Holt took a seat near the back, said nothing, needed to say nothing. The documents were already speaking for him. Eleanor entered moments later. The room fell silent again. She walked directly toward the front, then placed a single envelope on the conference table. "This is a letter my daughter wrote to me 23 years ago." Nobody moved. "I never received it." Her voice remained steady, barely, because it was intercepted. Spencer closed his eyes. The room felt smaller suddenly. Eleanor looked directly at him. You stole more than money. Silence filled every corner of the room. Some wounds couldn't be measured in dollars. $45 million had disappeared. 23 years of letters had disappeared. A lifetime of opportunities had disappeared. Yet somehow that single sentence carried more weight than all of it. You stole more than money. The vote occurred 40 minutes later. Removal as chairman. Removal from the board. Full cooperation with ongoing investigations. Unanimous. Every single vote. When it ended, Spencer remained seated. The room slowly emptied around him. No speeches, no dramatic arguments, no final defense, just consequences. Sometimes the end of a story arrived quietly. Outside, reporters had already gathered. Headlines were forming. Statements were being prepared. Lawyers were making calls. The machine of accountability had finally started moving. That evening, Camille drove to Holt's house. The harbor glowed beneath the orange light of sunset. Marlo sat on the porch waiting. Apparently, she'd been informed a celebration was necessary. Did you win? She asked immediately. Camille laughed. Something like that. Marlo nodded, then handed her a folded map. Good. Camille opened it carefully. Family Harbor, the latest version, larger than before, more detailed, more complete. Near the center sat a lighthouse. Nearby stood several houses connected by roads. No isolated houses remained at the edges. Camille smiled. You changed it. Marlo nodded. Everybody found their way home. Silence followed. Not sad silence. Peaceful silence. The kind that arrives after a storm finally passes. Holt stepped onto the porch carrying coffee. Eleanor arrived a few minutes later. For a while they simply sat together watching the harbor. No investigations. No trust funds. No board meetings. Just family. The kind built through blood, loss, forgiveness, and second chances. As the sun disappeared beyond the water, Marlo pointed toward the lighthouse on her map. See? Everyone looked. The Truth Lighthouse worked. Holt laughed softly. Camille smiled. Eleanor wiped away a tear, and somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the years of secrets and mistakes and missed opportunities, Maggie Crane Pemberton finally felt a little closer to home. 1 year later, Camden Harbor looked exactly the same. Fishing boats still left before sunrise. Tourists still crowded the waterfront during summer weekends. Seagulls still stole food whenever opportunities presented themselves. From a distance, it seemed as though nothing had changed. But people knew better, especially the people who had lived through the previous year. Holt Pemberton stood on the porch of his house, watching morning sunlight spread across the water. Coffee in one hand, a stack of scholarship applications in the other. The paperwork belonged to the Margaret Crane Foundation, an organization that hadn't existed 12 months earlier. Now it funded educational programs, community housing grants, and scholarships for children who had spent too much of their lives being overlooked. The money came from the recovered trust assets. $45 million returned to its rightful purpose. Not exactly the way anyone originally planned, but close enough. Behind him, the front door burst open. Marlo sprinted onto the porch carrying a rolled-up map. At 8 years old, she had somehow become even more enthusiastic about cartography. Holt wasn't sure how that was possible. Emergency. Holt lowered his coffee. Should I call somebody? Probably. Marlo handed him the map. The lighthouse district needs expansion. Holt studied the drawing seriously. This is concerning. Very. He nodded. We'll get through it. Marlo seemed reassured. Across town, Camille Hadley sat inside the executive conference room at Hadley Group, reviewing quarterly reports. The difference was that she actually enjoyed her job again. For years, she had spent more time managing appearances than solving problems. Now the company focused on transparency, innovation, and community partnerships. The atmosphere felt lighter, more honest, more human. Her assistant entered carrying a folder. The foundation board wants final approval. Camille smiled. Already? They're waiting. She stood immediately. Some meetings mattered more than others. 20 minutes later, she walked into a smaller conference room overlooking Camden Harbor. Holt was already there. So was Eleanor. Several trustees occupied the remaining seats. At the center of the table sat a framed photograph, Maggie Crane Pemberton, smiling exactly as she always had. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Eleanor looked around the room. Her voice remained steady now, stronger than it had been a year ago. Let's help some people. The motion passed unanimously. More scholarships, more grants, more opportunities. Every signature felt like a small correction to history. Not a complete correction. Nothing could do that, but enough. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited Holt's house. By now, she no longer knocked. Marlowe considered the formality unnecessary. They sat together on the porch while the harbor breeze drifted through the pine trees. Marlowe immediately presented a new map. Eleanor accepted this as part of the standard greeting procedure. "What's this one?" she asked. Marlowe pointed proudly. "Future Harbor." Eleanor smiled. "Future Harbor?" "Yep." Tiny houses lined the waterfront. Roads connected neighborhoods. Lighthouses stood at strategic points along the coast. Everything appeared carefully planned. Then Eleanor noticed something. Near the center sat a large building labeled MC Foundation. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Who's that for?" Marlowe looked surprised. "Mom." Silence settled softly across the porch. Eleanor traced the little building with her finger. Maggie, even now, even after everything, still helping people, still bringing people together. Somehow that felt exactly right. That evening, Camden Harbor hosted a community celebration marking the first anniversary of the foundation. Families filled the waterfront park. Students who had received scholarships mingled with local business owners. Children ran between booths carrying balloons. The atmosphere felt warm, hopeful, earned. Holt stood near the harbor railing watching the crowd. Camille joined him a few moments later. Neither spoke immediately. They simply watched people. Sometimes silence did the work conversation couldn't. Finally, Camille smiled. "You realize none of this happens if I don't drop a photograph." Holt laughed softly. "That's true. It's kind of embarrassing. Historically important, though." Camille nodded. "Fair." The harbor lights reflected across the water. Music drifted from the stage near the marina. Somewhere nearby, Marlowe was explaining lighthouse logistics to a confused city council member. Holt decided not to intervene. Some battles belong to other people. Camille leaned against the railing. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never knowing?" Holt looked toward the darkening horizon. The answer was yes. Of course yes. But he found himself thinking about it less often these days. Not as much anymore. Camille looked at him. "Why?" Holt smiled faintly. "Because now we know." The answer seemed almost too simple. Yet it was true. The truth had arrived. The questions had been answered. The people who needed to find each other had found each other. Not perfectly, not without loss. But they found each other anyway. Across the park, Marlowe suddenly appeared carrying yet another map. She waved it above her head triumphantly. "I fixed it!" Holt laughed. "What did you fix?" Marlowe pointed toward the center. "The lighthouse." Everyone leaned closer. The lighthouse stood larger than before. Brighter, more detailed. Eleanor smiled through tears. Camille laughed. Holt shook his head. "Why?" Marlowe looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because more people know where home is now." Silence followed. The good kind. The kind that settles over people when something true has just been said. Above them, the first stars appeared over Camden Harbor. Below them, families laughed and talked beneath strings of lights. And somewhere in all of it, Maggie Crane Pemberton's story continued doing what it had always done, bringing people home. 5 years later, the lighthouse still stood in the center of Marlowe's maps, not because she lacked imagination, not because she couldn't design something new, because some landmarks earned permanence. Camden Harbor had changed over those 5 years. New businesses opened along the waterfront. Old buildings found new purposes. Students who once received scholarships from the Margaret Crane Foundation were now teachers, engineers, nurses, and entrepreneurs. The foundation itself had become one of the most respected charitable organizations in New England. Yet the people who helped create it still measured success differently. They measured it in second chances. On a warm September afternoon, Holt Pemberton stood outside the Margaret Crane Community Center watching volunteers prepare for the annual Family Harbor Festival. The building overlooked the water. Children raced across the lawn. Music drifted from speakers being tested near the main stage. The entire scene felt impossible compared to where life had been 5 years earlier. A dropped photograph, a forgotten letter, a hidden trust fund. Sometimes the biggest stories began with the smallest accidents. You missed a spot. Holt looked down. Marlowe stood beside him holding a clipboard. At 13, she had grown taller, smarter, and significantly more confident. Unfortunately, she had also inherited the ability to notice details. A spot? Holt asked. She pointed toward a banner hanging near the entrance. The left side is crooked. Holt squinted. Nobody will notice. Marlowe looked horrified. I noticed. Fair enough. Some arguments couldn't be won. Across the parking lot, Camille Hadley stepped from her car carrying a stack of event programs. She no longer looked like the woman who spent her life hiding behind boardroom walls. Success still followed her. The company had grown. The foundation had expanded. But the sharp edges were gone now, replaced by something quieter, something stronger. She crossed toward them and immediately handed Marlowe the programs. Emergency delivery. Marlowe accepted them seriously. Excellent work. Camille smiled. I try. They had developed a language of their own over the years. Most of it involved maps. Later that afternoon, Eleanor Hadley arrived carrying a wooden box. The same box she'd brought every year since the foundation opened. Inside rested photographs. Maggie. Family pictures. Letters. Memories. Pieces of a life no longer hidden. The display had become part of the festival tradition. New visitors stopped to read. Older visitors stopped to remember. Eleanor arranged the photographs carefully, then paused before one image in particular. Maggie smiling beside a harbor dock. Young, happy, alive. The ache never disappeared completely, but it had changed. Grief no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like love that had finally found somewhere to go. As evening approached, hundreds of people gathered near the waterfront stage. Scholarship recipients shared stories. Local families spoke about community programs. Volunteers received recognition. The festival wasn't really about the foundation anymore. It was about what happened when people chose to help one another. Holt stood near the back of the crowd listening, exactly where he preferred to be. Then Marlowe appeared carrying a rolled map. Of course she did. Some traditions survived everything. I need volunteers. Holt immediately became suspicious. For what? The unveiling. Camille laughed. There's an unveiling? Marlowe looked offended. Obviously. Minutes later, she stood on stage beneath the evening lights while several hundred people watched. The harbor behind her glowed orange beneath the setting sun. For a moment she looked nervous. Then she spotted Holt, Camille, and Eleanor in the crowd. The nervousness vanished. When I was little, she began, I used to draw maps because I liked knowing where things were. The crowd smiled. Then I learned maps aren't really about places. She carefully unrolled the paper. They're about people. Silence settled across the waterfront. Marlowe revealed the largest map she had ever created. Family Harbor. Years of versions had evolved into this one. Roads connected neighborhoods, schools, libraries, parks, community centers, lighthouses, everywhere people might need help finding their way. Near the center stood a building labeled Margaret Crane Foundation. Beside it sat another marker, Maggie's Lighthouse. Eleanor covered her mouth immediately. Tears appeared before she could stop them. Marlowe pointed toward the lighthouse. Lighthouses don't make people come home. A familiar smile crossed her face. They just help people find the way. Holt looked down. Camille reached for his hand. Neither commented on it. Some things no longer required discussion. The crowd applauded. But Marlowe wasn't finished. She pointed toward dozens of tiny houses scattered across the map. These are all the people who got help. Then toward the roads connecting them. And these are all the people who helped. Finally, she looked toward Eleanor. Then Camille. Then Holt. And this is what happens when people stop hiding the truth. For a moment, nobody spoke. The harbor breeze moved softly through the crowd. Sunset reflected across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn sounded. Then applause erupted. Not loud, not dramatic. Warm, genuine, earned. Later that evening, after the festival ended and the waterfront grew quiet, the four of them sat together on a dock overlooking Camden Harbor. The same harbor that had witnessed every beginning and every ending. Lights shimmered across the water. Stars filled the sky. Marlowe leaned against Holt's shoulder. Eleanor held one of Maggie's old photographs. Camille watched the reflections dancing across the harbor. Nobody felt the need to fill the silence. Finally, Holt looked toward the horizon. Years earlier, he had believed the story was about a missing photograph. Then he thought it was about a missing inheritance. Then a hidden fraud. But sitting there beneath the stars, he finally understood. It had always been about family. Family lost. Family found. Family chosen. Family rebuilt. The photograph had only shown them where to start looking. The harbor remained calm. The lighthouse near the point flashed steadily in the distance. Once every few seconds, constant, reliable, guiding people home. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond grief, beyond time itself, Maggie Crane Pemberton was no longer the missing piece of a broken story. She had become the reason the story healed. The end.